to make a return to the world of Retroid, and I have to say this was an unexpected one, since never in my wildest dreams did I ever expect that the Retroid Pocket 5 and its little sibling the Retroid Pocket Mini would be in my hands running games from the PlayStation 3. In an awesome turn of events, the amazing team responsible for the PlayStation 3 emulator, RPCS3, announced ARM64 architecture support, and because both the Pocket 5 and Mini have support for Linux distributions, it was a match made in retro heaven. The equally amazing folks responsible for Rocknix wasted no time and began to integrate RPCS3 into Rocknix, and here we are today, the world of the PlayStation 3 in an itty-bitty living space. So I invite you to join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we start our journey into both Rocknix and RPCS3 and go through all the steps needed to get this up and running on our Retroid Pocket 5 and Mini and find out what this all means for PlayStation 3 emulation on the most unexpected of devices. Now, if you know me, you know how things work here, and so as always, before we begin, let's go over some things that we should expect here with RPCS3 on the Retroid Pocket 5 and Mini. This is definitely more along the lines of a fun thing to explore, and if you are a tinkerer like me, it's fun to mess around with, and I always like to show you what's possible as well as how to recreate what I've done here. I spent a few weeks testing and going through a decent portion of the PlayStation 3 library. But I kept my expectations in check, since I knew that this was truly pushing the limits of what is realistically possible with a Snapdragon 865, and so I plan to never really exceed beyond the lighter games that typically saw release on the PlayStation Network store. As such, most of the games in this video are lighter PSN titles, and the goal of this video is to help you get Rocknix and RPCS3 going, as well as show you a surprisingly decent number of games that are quite playable with RPCS3 on the Retroid Pocket 5 and Mini, which is always a nice bonus, since it just means that our handhelds can now play even more games than before. If you are just curious about game performance and what games are playable, feel free to skip ahead to the gameplay showcase. Otherwise, continue along as I go through the Rocknix and RPCS3 setup process, and as always, I will have everything timestamped for your convenience. So let's get into that, and of course, all this magic happens first with the setup of Rocknix for the Retroid Pocket 5 and Mini. But most importantly, with the latest cutting-edge dev builds, which are currently only available on the Rocknix Discord under the Dev Builds channel. I highly recommend joining the Rocknix Discord so that you can have access to the latest builds available. But I will link to the build that I am currently using for this video, which is the build from December 19th, and will most likely not be the latest version whenever you come across this video, since the team moves fast over at Rocknix. I also still recommend heading over to the Rocknix GitHub page, which is still a great resource to get things going and set up in case you prefer to read things over and not just listen to me talk for the next 10 minutes or so. The good news is Rocknix is very simple to get going. Now, before we embark on this journey, it's important to note that Rocknix on the Retroid Pocket 5 and Mini can only boot by restarting from Android and then choosing to boot into Rocknix after the restart. Now, this isn't a huge deal, at least for me, but I thought it was important to put that up front so you are at least aware of the current limitations. Okay, so for this, you will want to get a micro SD card, ideally one that is on the larger side, so you can load up a bunch of PlayStation 3 games and not worry about the space too much. Next, we will want to download the Rocknix image. Again, I will have the version that I used linked in the description, or you can head on over to the Rocknix Discord and get the latest build available for the Snapdragon 865 devices. Finally, we need a tool to flash the image to the micro SD card. The Rocknix team recommends several different tools, and personally I use Balena Etcher, which I will have linked down below, and it works great for our use case. Once you've downloaded and installed the tool, go ahead and open it up, and then we can proceed with flashing the image to our micro SD card. Your screen should look something like this. Now click on Flash from File, and then select the Rocknix image that you download. You can choose the file as is, and you don't need to extract anything beforehand. With the Rocknix Snapdragon 865 image loaded, go ahead and connect your micro SD card to your computer if you haven't done so already. We need to select the target, or in other words, where we want the Rocknix image to go. I have a few drives on my PC, and you will most likely have the same thing, so you'll want to make sure that your micro SD card is selected. In this case, I am using a 256GB micro SD card for this demonstration. As always, double check your selection here, since you can accidentally wipe an important storage device. Now select Flash and let the tool do its thing, and if you're on a Windows PC like I am, you will probably have a prompt saying you need to format a disk. Just ignore that. I also recommend double checking that your micro SD card is not listed so that you can safely remove the card. Okay, grab your micro SD card and then place it into your Retroid Pocket 5 or mini device. Now you can see that I am in Android right now, and as I mentioned, Rocknix can only be booted by restarting from within the Android environment. It's pretty straightforward to do this. You will need to hold down on the power button on your Retroid device until you get the prompt to restart the device. This is the same process for the 5 or the mini. Now get ready because you will need to hold down on the volume up once it enters into the restart process. You can see I have my finger ready to go and I will go ahead and tap on restart, and then hold down on the volume up button. After a few seconds, the U-Boot menu will appear on screen. The cool thing about Rocknix here is that you can select which device you are using, so either the mini or the 5, and you can also move the micro SD card between the two devices. To make a selection on this menu, you use the volume up and down and then the power button to confirm. Since we are on the Retroid Pocket 5, I will select that option and then let Rocknix continue its initial setup process. This will be slightly longer the first time, but subsequent boot ups into Rocknix will be faster since it doesn't need to do the initial setup process. Once Rocknix is done, it will restart your device and then you'll be back into Android. So like before, just do the restart process by holding down the power button, tap on restart, and then hold down on the volume up button to get into the U-Boot menu again. Like before, I will select the Retroid Pocket 5, but of course select the option that corresponds to your device. Okay, Rocknix will do its thing again, and after a moment you should launch into the home screen of Rocknix. This is what Rocknix looks like the first time you get into the home screen, and there are a few things here, but since this is a video focused on RPCS3, let's continue on to get that going here on the Retroid Pocket. So if we scroll over to the Tools section and then scroll down here, we will have the option to launch into RPCS3. But we're not quite ready to do that yet, since RPCS3 does require the PlayStation 3 firmware, and of course we also don't have any games ready to go. And so this is the perfect time to get that ready to go. Now I personally like to use a combination of connecting the Retroid Pocket with USB to my PC, and then later on I will use a program like FileZilla to make some changes over Wi-Fi. So back out to the main screen again and press start. You will get the main menu pop up, and from here scroll down to network settings and then scroll down until you get to the USB gadget function. By default this is disabled. We want to change this setting to MTP, which will allow us to use a USB cable to directly connect the Retroid Pocket to our computer. Now press B to confirm the setting and enable the MTP function on the handheld. There will be a momentary pause before it backs out to the prior menu, and now we can head back on over to our computer with a USB cable and connect our Retroid Pocket. So if you're using a Windows computer like I am, when you connect your Retroid Pocket, you should get a window that pops up with the Rocknix device and a ROMs directory. This is how you would add your games and any other files easily with a USB connection. You can see we already have a PS3 folder to work with, but before we start adding games, we do need to go and grab the PlayStation 3 firmware for RPCS3. So just head on over to Google and search for PS3 firmware, and you should be able to find what you're looking for pretty easily. I recommend to download the latest firmware file, which is version 4.91, and the file should have a file name of ps3 update.pup. So what I like to do here is just copy over the PlayStation 3 firmware file to your PS3 ROMs folder, which we will use in just a moment when we head back to our device. And before we head back to our device, we might as well add some PlayStation 3 games since we have our USB cable connected. Now the instructions here are specifically for disc-based games first, and then we will talk about PlayStation Network games afterwards. When it comes to our disc-based PlayStation 3 games, this is the easiest to get set up by far. On Rocknix, we can only make use of the Vulkan backend when we launch our games directly from Emulation Station, and not directly from RPCS3. So I will explain how to get our disc-based games detected by Emulation Station from within Rocknix. Okay, so let's use Under Defeat HD as an example, which I have here ready to go. Now all PS3 disc-based games will have the PS3_game folder within the directory. Some of them might have other folders like the PS3_update folder that you see here. All you have to do is copy over the folder with the subfolders inside of them to your PS3 ROMs folder on the Rocknix pre-populated ROMs folder. So in my case, I'll just copy and paste the Under Defeat HD folder to the PS3 folder under the ROMs directory. Once the folder has been copied over, all you have to do is rename the folder with the game title and the .ps3 extension in order for it to be detected by Emulation Station in the game lists as shown here. And that's all there is to it when it comes to disk-based games. It's a pretty simple process. So let's now talk about PlayStation Network PKG files, which is a bit more complicated to get to show up in the games list for Rocknix. The first thing I recommend doing while we are still connected by USB is to copy over your PKG files as well as any applicable licenses usually found in a RAP or EDAT format. For example, I have Hell Yeah, Wrath of the Dead Rabbit, and for this game I have a few PKG files as well as that RAP license file. Let's just go ahead and copy these files over to the same PS3 directory under the ROMs folder. I recommend doing this for any other PlayStation Network games you might have. Now I like to put them in their own folders for organizational purposes. We will continue these steps to get these games installed in just a little bit. Now with everything copied over, including our firmware, a disk-based game, and a PSN game, let's head on back over to our Retroid Pocket device and launch RPCS3 for the first time from the tools section. Now I'm going to use a USB mouse connected with a USB-C to USB-A adapter just to make things a little bit easier on myself when navigating the interface here. You don't need to do this, but it definitely makes things a lot easier if you're able to get one connected. You can totally just use a touchscreen, which I've done plenty of when setting things up here. Okay, let's start RPCS3 for the first time, and for anyone that's used RPCS3 in the past, this interface should look very familiar. So RPCS3 will say that we are missing our firmware, so let's go ahead and install the RPCS3 firmware, which is a pretty simple thing to do since we've already copied our file over. Go to File at the top and then scroll down and select the Install Firmware option. The file selection screen will pop up, just simply go to your ROMs folder, and then go to the PS3 folder, and your PS3 update.pup file should be listed here. Select that file and then let RPCS3 do its thing, which will take a few minutes to complete. Okay, once that's done, let's exit out of RPCS3 for a moment by selecting File and then Exit. On the Rocknix home screen, press Start and then go to Game Settings and select Update Game Lists. Your PS3 section should now pop up only if you've added disk-based games. You can see here that I have Under Defeat HD, which we added over together and is a disk-based game. But if you notice, Hell Yeah is not listed here, and that's because it's a PlayStation Network package, which means we will need to take a few extra steps before it shows up here in the games list. Again, we need to launch our PlayStation 3 games from here in order to make use of the Vulkan backend. Otherwise, we are limited to just OpenGL when launching from within RPCS3. Let's go back and launch RPCS3 again from the Tools section and install our PSN games. This is what you would do with any games that you have that are in the PSN format, such as a PKG file. If you remember, we copied over the files for Hell Yeah, so let's go ahead and install it. You can do this by selecting File and then selecting Install Packages. Once again, we will get the file selection window to pop up. Now for simplicity, we added our PSN games to the PS3 ROMs folder, so navigate to this directory by going through ROMs and then PS3 and then select the PKG file that you want to install, which in my case is for Hell Yeah. RPCS3 will give you a prompt, just say yes to install it and then wait a moment. Once RPCS3 is done installing the game, it should appear in the game list right here. Now, nearly every PSN game will require a license of some sort that is typically in an RAP or EDAT format. So make sure to go back to File and then select Install Package again and select any of the additional files you need to apply. Once you've done all of that, we're actually not going to launch our game from here. Instead, we need to exit and do a few final steps to get Hell Yeah to show up in our games list, which as you can see here is not listed. So let's go ahead and fix that issue. For this next step, we need to make sure that we have our network connection set up on the device. So take a moment to set up your Wi-Fi connection on the Retroid Pocket. You can do this by pressing Start anywhere on the Rocknix menu and then go to Network Settings and make sure that Wi-Fi is enabled, and then select and connect to your Wi-Fi network. So we need our computers once again. Now there are multiple ways of doing this, but for me I found this to be the easiest way to get the PSN games detected by Emulation Station. We need to go ahead and grab FileZilla from their official website, which I will have linked down below. Once you've downloaded and installed FileZilla on your computer, open it up, and we do need to get some information from our Retroid Pocket device. FileZilla should look a bit like this, and what we're going to do is connect to our Retroid Pocket through Wi-Fi and then go in and edit some files. The reason I like doing it this way is because it's simple to go in and create a file and then edit it right there. You can also use this method to copy games over as well, and if your network is strong enough, this is a pretty decent way to get your files over. In the top left corner, we need to enter our host address, which is the IP address of the Retroid Pocket device. You can find this information by pressing Start anywhere in Rocknix and then going to Network Settings, and if your Wi-Fi is connected, you will take the IP address from here and then type it into the host section on FileZilla. In the next area, we need the username, which by default is just root. And then we will need to enter the password, which by default is Rocknix. In case you want to verify this or change it, you can do this by pressing Start anywhere in the Rocknix interface, then scroll down to System Settings, and then all the way at the bottom, go to Security, and the root password will be listed here. Finally, enter 22 for the port number, and then hit Quick Connect. You will notice that we can see the files on our Retroid Pocket device. If we go into the ROMs folder, we've got all of our files that we copied over from before. The thing is, we already installed both the firmware and Hell Yeah, except that this is not where RPCS3 installs the files to. Instead, it's actually placed in the BIOS folder here under the ROMs directory. So let's go back out of the PS3 ROMs folder and then go into the BIOS folder. Inside this folder, we have the RPCS3 folder that's been automatically created. And then from here, head into the dev_hdd0 folder, and finally head into the game folder, which is where Hell Yeah was installed to. Now, if you've installed a bunch of PSN games, you will have a bunch of folders here with random letters and numbers, but these are actually not so random. They are game IDs, and we will need these in order to set up our game list for Rocknix. For example, here I have NPUB30750. Now, that doesn't mean a whole lot, but if you were to copy this ID and paste it into Google, a quick search will let you know that this is Hell Yeah, which is exactly what we want. So now we can go back to that PS3 folder in the ROMs directory. Right-click on a white space in the window here and then select Create New File. We're going to name this file Hell Yeah, Wrath of the Dead Rabbit, and then add the .psn to the name as the extension. For this, you want to use the name of your PSN game, which is why I went with this full title. Now, if you notice, for disk-based games, we use .ps3, and for PSN games, we use .psn. Select OK, and now the file should appear in this list as a PSN file. So we need to right-click on this file and then select View and Edit, which will open up a text editor, which in my case, it opened up a blank notepad. All we have to do here is add that game ID, which for Hell Yeah is NPUB30750, and then hit File and Save. FileZilla will give you a prompt to upload this file back to the server. Just hit yes so that the changes made are updated. These are the steps that are needed to get PSN games to show up in your game list in Rocknix. By the way, while we are connected here, we might as well do some cleanup and delete the firmware file you copied over, since it was already installed somewhere else, as well as delete any of the PKG files that you copied over here. Let's go back to our Retroid Pocket device, press Start, and select Update Game List. And now you can see that both Hell Yeah and Under Defeat HD are showing up in my game list, which is exactly what we want, and now we've got everything all properly set up. So let's cover some final housekeeping steps and tips to get the most out of your RPCS3 experience. Within Rocknix, you can adjust a few things to adjust performance settings for RPCS3. Now you can set this as a universal setting by pressing Start and then going to Game Settings, and all the way at the bottom go to Per System Advanced Configuration, and then PlayStation 3, which will allow you to adjust things like aspect ratio, resolution scaling, and the graphics backend. The first option, which is System Options, and in here, I do recommend setting the cores used to all cores, with an auto cooling profile since Rocknix does some weird things with the other fan profiles. And then setting the CPU scaling governor to performance, as well as the GPU performance profile to best performance. Now you can set per game settings by pressing X on a game title and then scrolling down to advanced game options, and then from here you can adjust the same settings but on a per game basis. Throughout this video, I will let you know what settings I am using for each of the games, and personally I like using the per game settings options to tweak, but go with what works best for you. Now you can also go into Tools and launch RPCS3 from this section and then modify settings through here. But ideally, I recommend just sticking to use the Rocknix interface and launching games for Emulation Station, which will allow you to use either the Vulkan or OpenGL backends. Also, I noticed that when launching a game for the first time, RPCS3 will do its usual compilation at launch, but some games will just stop at the initial compilation. No worries though, I've found that if you exit and then start the game up again, it will work just fine. For example, I had that issue with TMNT Reshelled, which I will showcase later on, but is a game that just stopped at 99% compilation, and so I exited and restarted the game, and it worked just fine. And finally, I just want to reiterate that RPCS3 on a device like the Retroid Pocket 5 and Mini are very much pushing the limits of what's possible with this hardware. The current build of Rocknix that supports RPCS3 is also still in development, so if you plan on testing your own games, or even trying out the ones here, you should expect that there will be issues, such as games that will freeze or just crash at random. I did plenty of device restarts as well when doing testing, and so that should be another thing to expect here, as well as just random glitches like sound that disappears when launching a game. With all of this in mind, this is still very much an incredible thing to see happening here. And so, without further ado, let's get into the game's showcase. Let's start things off with one of my personal favorites from the PlayStation Network, and given that I'm a huge shmup fan, 1942 Joint Strike is definitely my kind of game. Joint Strike is a remake of the original 1942 game, and not only gives the game a visual overhaul, but also includes elements from other games in the franchise like the classics 1943 and 1941. The game was only released for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 on their digital storefronts, and sadly those versions remain the only way to play this game, which makes the PS3 version great to have with RPCS3 because we can enjoy this game quite well on our Retroid Pocket devices. Joint Strike is easily one of the more stable experiences here, and I have the game set to use the Vulkan backend with a 100% resolution scale at the native PlayStation 3 resolution. As I mentioned earlier in the video, we will be seeing quite a few PlayStation Network games since they typically were on the lighter end of performance requirements when it comes to emulation. Afterburner Climax is part of the long-running Afterburner series, and this one is just plain fun, staying very true to the arcade roots that the series is best known for, with Afterburner Climax first appearing in the arcades and then making its way over to the home console digital storefronts, but sadly has been delisted for the better part of a decade. The game did receive a mobile version, and those likewise are also no longer available, which yet again shows why emulation is so very important, because otherwise this game would be lost to time. I will admit I wasn't expecting this one to be as playable as it is, despite it being one of the easier to emulate PS3 games, and here with the Retroid Pocket 5 and Mini, we can handle a 75% resolution scale using 720p and the Vulkan backend. I will say that this game did crash on me as I progressed through the stages, but it seems to be random, so just keep that in mind. Aquapazza has been a long-time PlayStation 3 exclusive and is a 2D fighting crossover game developed by Aqua Plus. This is a pretty solid 2D fighter that probably will mostly be unrecognizable to the North American audience. Now, as a pleasant surprise, this game is getting a Windows version sometime next year, and so its reign as an exclusive for the PlayStation 3 and arcades will soon be coming to an end. Now, given that we had some 3D PlayStation Network games prior to this entry, I don't think it's all too surprising that Aquapazza is running very well here, with RPCS3 using a 100% resolution scale at the native resolution setting with the Vulkan backend. It's always a good thing when we can add another game to the list of playable titles, and so if you are a fighting game fan, definitely check this one out as it's a pretty interesting entry. Now, speaking of interesting entries, during the 7th generation, Capcom went through its massive library of classic titles and properties and started giving them the remastered treatment. Bionic Commando was one of those franchises that received the remake treatment with Bionic Commando Rearmed. And this is one impressive remake that manages to not only stay true to its source material, but also managed to update it for a new audience by giving it much needed enhancements to the classic formula. Rearmed also served as a prequel to Capcom's reboot of Bionic Commando that released after Rearmed, and sadly, like Rearmed, is mostly forgotten by today's gamers. This game, like many of the entries in this video, was released as a digital storefront exclusive for both PSN and Xbox Live Arcade, and also did receive a PC port that is still available for purchase on Steam, but it does have some compatibility issues with Windows 11. Bionic Commando Rearmed is another entry that does very well here at a 100% resolution scale at 720p using the Vulkan backend, and this one comes highly recommended, especially if you're a fan of the classic Bionic Commando game. Bleach Soul Resurrection, much like Aquapazza, is a long-time PlayStation 3 exclusive that I've covered numerous times on the channel, including most recently in my full feature-length film with RPCS3 and the ROG Ally X, where I featured 100 games on that handheld, and it is still the longest video I've ever done on the channel. Bleach Soul Resurrection is definitely my kind of game, as I just love hack and slash games, and so I'm here for the fun gameplay. But Bleach fans should definitely pay attention to this title, as this is a full-blown PlayStation 3 exclusive that was partly developed by Sony's Japan studio. Now, during my lengthy testing with the Retroid Pocket 5 and RPCS3, I went through some of the games I have covered in prior videos and put together a list of potential candidates for these handhelds, and Bleach was definitely one I was hopeful would do pretty well, and it does seem to be the case as it definitely performs better than I expected. I do have the game set to use a 75% resolution scale at 720p with the Vulkan backend. And while the game isn't always full speed depending on the gameplay scenario, I think this is still an impressive showcase, and again it's just fun to be able to push the limits of what's possible with these devices and add another game that, without Rocknix and RPCS3, would otherwise not be playable any other way. And what do you know it, we've got another digital exclusive, and Galaga Legions DX is the sequel to the original Galaga Legions and is the 14th entry in the Galaxian series, but Legions and Legions DX definitely takes the series in a slightly different direction, turning it into more of an action-focused bullet-hell twin-stick shooter, while still retaining some of the elements that Galaga is known for, such as taking on waves of enemies. The game was developed by the same team responsible for Pac-Man Championship Edition, and does share some similarities, at least visually, to that game, which for me personally is easily one of the best things about this game. Galaga Legions DX is just pure arcade fun with tons of action and an awesome soundtrack that all ties together to keep you pumped up as you take on the waves of enemies. I also think that Galaga Legions is the perfect game for a handheld or mobile device with its pick-up and play mechanic, and back in the day Namco felt the same way, since it did receive a port to Windows Phone of all platforms. Galaga Legions DX runs great with RPCS3 at a 100% resolution scale, using the native resolution and the Vulkan backend. And I always love having an opportunity to talk about this next game, which has made multiple appearances on the channel going way back to the very early days. Hardcore Uprising is another digital exclusive for both Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network, and this is a pretty interesting game. First off, Arc System Works handled development for this game, the same studio responsible for games like Guilty Gear and Blaze Blue. And so this studio traditionally has developed 2D fighting games, but with Hardcore's Uprising, the studio took quite the departure with them taking on the run and gun genre. And based on its name and style of gameplay, you may or may not realize, but Hardcore's Uprising is part of the Contra series, and is the 13th installment in the Contra franchise. This game serves as a prequel to Contra Hardcore, and so there are obvious similarities to other Contra games, but in many ways this is its own thing, and that was the original intention when this game came out many years ago. Unfortunately, Arc never returned to the franchise, and so this really is just a one-off in the Contra series, and remains one of the more interesting digital exclusives from the 7th generation. As always, thanks to emulation, this game can be enjoyed on different platforms, and here on the Retroid Pocket 5 and Mini, we are yet again treated to a game that performs very well with a 100% resolution scale at native resolution and the Vulkan backend. Now, one of the things that I love about doing videos like this is not just to help viewers out sort through games and get going with PlayStation 3 emulation on the Retroid Pocket, but these videos actually help me rediscover games that I haven't thought about in years or just simply forget exists. Hell yeah, Wrath of the Dead Rabbit is one of those gems that really I don't think many remember or talk about much today, and it's not all too surprising since it was kind of a low-key release back when it was released for the digital platforms as well as PC. The studio behind this game is no longer around as well, and so it's just kind of fallen into obscurity despite still being available on the Steam store and published by Sega. Hell yeah is a platform game with a lot of charm, a great visual style, solid humor, and non-stop action. Plus, you get to play as an undead rabbit that is the Prince of Hell and uses all sorts of crazy types of weapons, including a saw blade jetpack that allows you to move around levels. Hell yeah is well worth the time to check out, and thankfully this game isn't a hell no on the Retroid Pocket since it runs very well with RPCS3 at 100% resolution scale using the native PS3 resolution with the Vulkan backend. The game is also available on PC, and so if you're on the Android side, it's possible this one will run well with Winlator, but I haven't tested it myself just yet. It seems pretty appropriate to follow up with another fairly obscure game that really only the most dedicated shooter fans will know about. Mamoru-kun Curse is a shoot 'em up from the folks at G-Rev, and this studio is definitely no stranger to shmups and have been around for quite some time, giving us real gems like Under Defeat. For whatever reason, back in the day, the Xbox 360 was kind of the home for a lot of these Japanese shmups, but this one did receive a port to the PlayStation 3 a few years after the Xbox 360 release, and most importantly, an official release on the PlayStation Network for North America. Now obviously that's a good thing for us today since we can now enjoy this game with RPCS3. And I really do enjoy this game, and it's not your typical shmup since the scrolling is not automatic and you are able to move in all directions. This game actually reminds me a bit of Pocky and Rocky, which is definitely a good thing. Now, similar to Aquapazza, this game is being resurrected out of nowhere and will be seeing a re-release for the PlayStation 5, Xbox Series, Switch, and PC sometime next year. But why wait to experience this awesome game when it works great on the Retroid Pocket with RPCS3 at a 100% resolution scale and native resolution using Vulkan? Back around the time the PlayStation 3 was current, there was an awesome franchise known as Puzzle Quest that has sort of made a return recently, and Puzzle Quest is best described as a match 3 Bejeweled style puzzle game that featured RPG elements and made for some very interesting gameplay mechanics. There was a very cool version of this game that featured the Marvel Universe, known as none other than Marvel Puzzle Quest, that features 358 playable, unlockable, and recruitable Marvel characters, so for a Marvel fan, this is a real treat. Now, the game is available on Android, but I much prefer the PlayStation 3 version since it's not a free-to-play experience and also has full controller support, but best of all, it works quite well with RPCS3 on the Retroid Pocket devices. The game is playable at 1080p with 100% resolution scaling using the Vulkan backend, and while the game has some minor text issues on some screens, it's definitely not a deal breaker, and one I'd highly recommend loading up on your device, as this is a finely crafted game that makes excellent use of the Marvel Universe. Odin Sphere is certainly a game that I have featured many times on the channel, and this is a full-blown PlayStation exclusive that began first on the PlayStation 2 and then received a remake for the PlayStation 3, 4, and Vita. And so this version is a bit different than the PlayStation 2 one and very much well worth checking it out on your Retroid Pocket devices. Now, at first glance, the fantastic action RPG from the folks at Vanillaware might appear to be running quite well. And for the most part, given what we're working with here, I'd say it's doing better than I expected. But this game, for whatever reason, has these momentary pauses during gameplay that I experienced on both Vulkan and OpenGL, and so this game does come with that caveat, and given we have the Vita version available to us, that might be the better option here for the Retroid Pocket 5. Regardless, I have this game set to use a 75% resolution scale at 720p with the Vulkan backend, and if those pauses don't bother you too much, then definitely give this game a shot. Outland is truly a game that fits the description of lost to time, since at this point many probably don't remember this game, and for me this is an absolute gem of a game that comes from Housemarque, a studio that I hold in high regard and more recently known for Returnal. But this studio has cooked up all sorts of great experiences, which explains why Sony snatched them up back in 2021. So back to Outland, this is a platformer with Metroidvania elements that uses a very cool light and dark polarity mechanic inspired by games like Ikaruga, and combined with the awesome art style makes for a pretty special game. I'm beyond excited that a gem like Outland works at all with RPCS3 on the Retroid Pocket, and it works very well with a 100% resolution scale at the native PS3 resolution with the Vulkan backend. Nowadays, I believe Outland can only be purchased on the Xbox digital storefront, with the Steam and PSN versions both delisted, and so thanks to RPCS3, many more can still enjoy this awesome game. And it just so happens that we are following up with another Housemarque game, and this one is a personal favorite of mine, and a selfish inclusion since I didn't care how much I had to adjust the settings to get this to some kind of playable state. Resogun is a shoot 'em up with many interesting elements taken from various games like Defender, but also is very much drawn from Housemarque's own games, like Super Stardust HD. I never get tired of this game, regardless of how I play it, but most importantly for those of us with a Retroid Pocket 5 or Mini, the PS3 version is essentially the only way to play the game well enough since the Vita version has some serious graphical issues with Vita 3K. Now, in order to achieve the level of performance you are seeing here with this game, I had to turn things way down, and so as I said before, this is just making the list because I personally love this game. For Resogun, I am set to use a 50% resolution scale at a resolution of 576p, using the Vulkan backend, and even with these settings there are dips in the frame rate. But despite the hilariously low settings, the game is pretty fun to play on here, and I'd say still very much worth checking out since honestly it's just wild to see this game running on this device at all. And yes, we have yet another Housemarque game making the list, and I promise you this wasn't intentional, but as I've said before, Housemarque cooked up some great experiences, especially during the PlayStation 3 era. Super Stardust HD is another shoot 'em up from the studio, but this is a bit different than Resogun. And Super Stardust HD is an enhanced version of an old Amiga game known as, you better believe it, Super Stardust. Nowadays, Super Stardust is basically a PlayStation exclusive franchise, with versions released for the PlayStation Portable as well as a sequel released for the PlayStation Vita. But for this video, the PlayStation 3 version Super Stardust HD works very well with RPCS3 using a 100% resolution scale at the native PS3 resolution and the Vulkan backend. This is a great game to load up on a handheld device thanks to its pick up and play style of gameplay, that is always addictive and a great way to kill some time. Our next game is a pretty interesting entry, since I'm not sure how many remember it or know that it exists, but back in 2009, Ubisoft released a remake of the very awesome Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles beat 'em up from Konami, Turtles in Time, for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, known as Reshelled. The game is no longer available on any platform since it was delisted more than a decade ago because of the TMNT licensing that Ubisoft no longer carries. And this is why emulation is yet again very important for preservation of titles like this one. Reshelled won't blow anyone away with its gameplay, but the updated visuals are cool to see, and it is quite faithful to the original Konami game, and still worth checking out, especially if you are a fan of the Konami beat-em-ups like I am. For this footage, I am set to use a 75% resolution scale at the PS3's native resolution, using the Vulkan backend, and the frame rate is mostly in the 50s. You can adjust the resolution scaling to 50%, which will get you mostly locked at the full 60 frames per second if you don't mind sacrificing the visuals, but I found the 75% scale to be perfectly playable. And finally, we've reached our last game, and Virtua Fighter 5 Final Showdown is game number 16, which honestly, I can't believe that there are this many games that are playable with RPCS3 on the Retroid Pocket 5 and Mini. I don't think Virtua Fighter needs much of an introduction, with this game being the 5th entry in the long-running fighting game franchise. Final Showdown is one of the later versions of Virtua Fighter 5 that released, and it received a port to both the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. So while testing this game, it was a bit interesting, and for whatever reason, setting the game to use a 576p resolution drops the frame rate cap to 30 frames per second, so I definitely recommend just sticking to the native resolution for this game. For the footage, I am using a 50% resolution scale, and surprisingly the OpenGL backend, which seems to respond better with this game specifically. Despite the 50% resolution scale and the native PlayStation 3 resolution setting, the game still can't quite get locked to 60 frames per second, but we are pretty close here to full speed, and this is a good demonstration of the upper limits of what we can get away with here on the Retroid Pocket 5 and RPCS3, and a pretty nice way to end this showcase. And so that does it for this video, and I really can't believe that this is even possible, and never would I have ever imagined seeing PlayStation 3 games running on a device like the Retroid Pocket 5, and thanks to the Rocknix support, which opens the doors to RPCS3, we now have even more games to play on these very capable devices, and really that's what this is all about. I hope you enjoyed this video pushing the boundaries of what is possible, and I do hope that it ends up being helpful if you decide to try this out for yourself. Until the next video, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.